let's add our first module. Like we're going to experience modules now. I know I talked about it a little bit, but let's get a taste for how it feels. Let's actually just write our first module. So we should have just an index.js, and it does nothing, right? So why don't we go ahead and create a new file in our source folder? And I'm tempted to let you name it anything you want, but why don't we start out with just something the same? Like we can follow with the same name. So we could say nav. We can call it nav.js, right? And what we want to do is we want to, let's say we want to write a nav element and put it on the DOM. That would be kind of cool, right? So if we'll start really small and just like console log some things, and then we'll maybe transform this nav to be something that's more useful. So the syntax, we have two things that we could do. If this is a file that we wanted to provide lots of different functionality, we might use the export syntax, and then whatever variables or expressions we want to provide, we would do so. Or if it's just like a single utility or a function or a single primitive, we want to use export default. Now, there is no nobody's going to stop you from doing like one or the other. But I want to just start out with export default so we can understand how to use it on the consumption side. So let's just start out by saying nav. Like, that's cool. Hey, it's a nav. That's exactly what it says is export default nav. You've written your first module. Now, what we want to do is we want this entry point to have access to this code because we're going to do something with it. So we're going to use import, and because it's default, we can name it anything we want. So I'm just going to call it nav because that's like not surprising to anybody. From, and then we're going to use the relative path to the index file for that file nav. So, and I'm going to take a moment to kind of describe, once we build Webpack here or we run it, how this kind of relative pathing works. Because this is actually a common JS pattern that was adopted, but is super helpful to understand so that trying to find out where a certain file is doesn't become frustrating. So, all right, and we should probably use it so that uglify.js doesn't strip out our code. So why don't we just console.log it and pass nav in, right? Great. And once we're there, why don't we just run our build command again? So let's just run it in production mode. So npm run prod. Well, look at that. I'll give you a second. Okay. So you've literally from scratch not only used an ESM module, but you've leveraged Webpack's ability to bundle it up and use it. What's so cool is that we haven't really done any browser-specific stuff yet. So has everybody gotten as far as building it? At least everybody here can, okay? So technically, if we wanted to see how this code works in action, we could just run it from Node, right? We don't have any browser-specific stuff. So if I went, so you might see a dist folder appear. You might be like, oh, what's this? By default, so the second default that we added was the output property. Basically just saying like, where does this file get created? What is the output that Webpack takes, and where does it go? So by default, it was kind of canonical in our ecosystem that dist was where your built web assets will go. It might be public, it might be whatever, and I'll show you how to change that. But dist is the default, and I think it's just main.js when you just have a single entry. So if we look at this code, you're like, Sean, it's minified. I don't understand any of it. And it's a lot of code for some tiny modules. But there's our console log, right? So why don't we just run this in Node now? So, oops. So if I go back into the terminal, node dist main.js. Wow. That was pretty cool. We now have been able to have that completed. Like, we took two modules, we put them together, and now its functionality is executed in the same way that we wrote the modules.